Today on Better Book Clubs, a recap of my reading year and my top 3 reads of 2024. I had a really great reading year in 2024. So first of all, I read 34 books, which for me is a big number, even though I know for a lot of booktubers it's not. But really what I judge my reading by is whether I met my goals for the year, which have to do with the breadth of my reading. So at the beginning of 2024, I set 8 reading goals for myself, which had to do with the types of books that I wanted to read this year. And I've been doing that for the past 5 years or so. And normally I fall short in some category, but this year I actually hit every one of them. Now, that may sound like not a big deal because obviously I knew what my categories were, so how hard could it be? But the way I go about it is I set my goals at the beginning of the year and then I just kind of read what I feel like reading. And at some point, usually early in the fall, I go back and look and see how I've done and try to fill in the gaps. When I went back to check in the fall, around September, I found that I had already done pretty well in meeting all of the categories except for one, which I'll talk about in a minute. The other thing that happened was I just read quite a few books that I really enjoyed this year. And so I've narrowed it down to my top 3, which I'll share with you in a few minutes. But there are definitely others that are close runners-up. So there are some years when everything I read is kind of like fine, but not exciting. And I felt like I read quite a few books this year that I really enjoyed. So let me give you a recap of the 8 categories that I chose for myself for 2024, and the one category in which I had a little bit of trouble. First of all, I wanted to read at least one book published by a small press. And that's a category that I've put on my list for the last few years because small press books can be a little bit harder to find. They're not as heavily marketed. There's not as much budget behind them. And unless they really hit it big, like Robin Kimmerer's Braiding Sweetgrass is a great example because it was published something like 10 years ago and has very slowly kind of made its way into people's minds and into conversation. And that's a small press book, which I read this year and really enjoyed. But there were a whole bunch of books that I read by small presses this year, which is unusual. In the past, when I've put this category on my list, I've sometimes only come up with one small press book, and for some reason this year this category was just packed full. So in the category of small press books, I read The Power of Trees, Mud, Rocks, Blazes, Letting Go on the Appalachian Trail, which is a really cool chronicle of one woman's hike on the AT trying to do a record-breaking walk, Braiding Sweetgrass, as I mentioned, and then some poetry by Jane Kenyon, as well as a Jane Kenyon biography, both of which were small press books. And then I read a book called The 5 Personality Patterns, which was recommended to me by my daughters. So all of those were small press books. And I really enjoyed them, and it's a category that I think is really important for everybody to think about because you do have to go out in search of these books. And so I've said this before, but don't neglect the small presses because some of the most interesting, thoughtful books are coming out from the small presses. And I'll leave a link in the comment section below to give you a little bit of help on how to find some of these small press books. Another category that I pledged to read in this year is the category of humor. So a lot of books that are called humor or shelved as humor actually aren't laugh out loud kind of books. They're more tragic comedies or satire. And what I'm really looking for is a book to make me laugh out loud. I had 2 books that really kind of floated to the surface in that category this year. I read some, for example, Catch-22, that while it's billed as a comedy, and in fact, the New York Times had a piece this year about 22 books since Catch-22 that are comic books, but I didn't find that a laugh out loud funny book like I was looking for. So there were 2 books that actually made me laugh out loud this year. The first one was a series of essays by Leslie Jordan, a comic actor, and he's basically became an Instagram sensation during the pandemic. The book is called How Y'all Doin', and I really enjoyed his essays, his his voice, his observations about life, and I listened to it on audio because this is one of those books that was really enjoyable hearing in the author's own voice. The problem was that after I finished it, and I was feeling really good about it, I went and read up some more on it and found out that Leslie Jordan had been killed in a car accident in 2022, and that just really brought me down, obviously. And so that book, while it made me laugh out loud at the time, I was really glad I didn't know the story of what followed, because at the end of the book, you know, Leslie Jordan says, oh, and I'm looking forward to writing my next book, and that never happened. The other book that made me laugh out loud multiple times this year, and again, it was something I listened to on audio as read by the author, was a book called Making Toast by Roger Rosenblatt. The book is about the death of Rosenblatt's daughter in her early 30s. She's the mom of 3 kids, and it's the story of the first year or so after her death when he and his wife move in to help their son-in-law take care of these 3 children who are now without a mother, and they're all working through their grief together. So this does not sound funny at all. And yet Rosenblatt's storytelling and his approach to the subject, he has a very wry sense of humor, and he's telling so many stories, sweet stories about his grandchildren that just really were touching and made me laugh. So I'm interested in reading some more of Rosenblatt's work because I really appreciate his voice, not just hearing his voice on audio, but his writing voice. So I'm going to seek him out some more. So those were the 2 most successful reads I had in the category of humor, but I'm going to keep looking because I find this is something that I really need more of, and something that's also very difficult to find. Funny books. I always also like to include on my list of goals a classic that I haven't read before, and I actually read 3 of them this year. One of them I'm going to talk about a little bit more in a minute, but the other 2 were Catch-22, as I mentioned, and then The French Lieutenant's Woman. And I had been thinking about reading The French Lieutenant's Woman for a long time. It was kind of on my radar as a book that I thought I would really love because it's a historical novel, and I knew that it was a very smart kind of experimental novel in some ways. But I have to say that I was a little bit disappointed in it. It just didn't quite land for me. I think there's something dated about it, which is kind of maybe a funny thing to say about historical fiction, but it's true that even when you're reading a historical novel, it's also set in the time in which it was written. I don't know if that's what the problem was with that novel for me, or whether I was, I guess I kind of have a standard, a bar that I've set with Possession by A.S. Byatt. That's probably my favorite historical novel. And so The French Lieutenant's Woman just didn't quite rise to that bar for me, and I thought it was going to. So I guess I went into it with a higher expectation. And it's not that I didn't enjoy it, but I wasn't as in love with it as I thought I would be. I also had world history on my list, and I read 2 books in that category. One of them is a book called River of Gods that's about the search for the source of the Nile River. It was very well written and interesting, but I also got pretty fed up actually with the male protagonists, if you will. I mean, it's nonfiction, but hardly any women in the story at all. And the men, I just found them really egotistical. And after a while, I got tired of spending time with them. So even though the story itself is very interesting and the quest for the source of the Nile was interesting, I just got a little bit tired after a while of spending time with these historical figures. The other world history book I read was a book called Galileo's Daughter, and it's by Dava Sobel. This was really an interesting one because I thought from the title that it was really going to be about Galileo's daughter. I was kind of more interested in her than I was in him. And you can kind of see from the cover that she was a nun. She was actually a cloistered nun, so she couldn't leave the abbey where she lived, which was right down the street from where her father Galileo lived. And it's intended to be a story, and it is a story about their relationship and you know, what he was accomplishing and how she was kind of supporting him in his work. But I had hoped to have more daughter and less Galileo in this book. So I really enjoyed it, but I kind of, again, I went into it with an expectation that wasn't quite met. And this is it brings up kind of an interesting topic, expectations that we enter into reading with, and how those color our experience of the books. Because of the title of this book, I was expecting it to be more about his daughter, and it's really much more about Galileo himself. It's interesting because there's a lot of historical documentation about their correspondence with one another, but as you can imagine, her life was quite limited because she was cloistered. He traveled, and he actually, as you probably know, faced some huge challenges in his scientific work and was negotiating those for many, many years. And I didn't really know any of the details of that story, so that was very interesting to learn more about. But this was one of my world history reads for 2024. I've also been reading a lot more science lately, and so contemporary science was on my list for 2024, and I did really well in this category as well. So in that field, I read not only Braiding Sweetgrass, but also The Power of Trees, The Soul of an Octopus, Beloved Beasts, and The Sixth Extinction, which I found especially interesting. Probably if I had to pull one book out of that category that I enjoyed the most, it was The Sixth Extinction, which may surprise you because I know so many people who really just love Braiding Sweetgrass, and I enjoyed it too, but I found this book to be the most thought-provoking, I guess, the one that made me think the most about the situation we're in. And this book is about 10 years old now, I believe. It was published originally in 2014. It won the Pulitzer Prize. And its subtitle is An Unnatural History. And so Elizabeth Kolbert is going through a number of different extinctions. First of all, there have been 5 major extinction events that we know of. And Kolbert is arguing that we're in the middle of the 6th one. She's got a whole bunch of different chapters where she goes out and she's doing kind of, it's a little bit of a travelogue in a way. She's talking about her own experience doing the research for the book. Highly recommended, even though it's an older book, I think it's still very relevant. So of all of the contemporary science I read this year, this was probably my favorite. Then we have the category of brand new fiction, and I'm not going to carry this one over into 2025 because I already have a method for making sure that I read some brand new fiction, which has to do with a book club I belong to. We call it the Hardcover Book Club, and each of us chooses one book that's only out in hardcover, so it's a brand new book. It might be fiction, it might be nonfiction. When we're done reading, we get together. There's only really 4 of us get together online and or sometimes in person actually now, and discuss the books and then loan them out to each other because hardcovers are kind of expensive, and so that way we get to trade books around. So this year, one of the brand new fiction books I read was This Strange Eventful History by Claire Massoud. I read this on vacation over the summer and I enjoyed it. It was good, but I would say that the book that I enjoyed even more was The Safekeep, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. But The Safekeep was shortlisted for the Booker Prize this year. It was a really great read, so more on that in a minute. So that's 6 categories. The 7th one is a book in translation. This is also, like small press books, a little bit challenging, which is why I've started to put it on my list, because you do have to kind of go out and look for books in translation a little bit more intentionally than you might have to if you were just looking, if you just go into Barnes & Noble and see what's on the front table. So I read 2 books in translation, actually one, and I'm just finishing up. It's the end of the year. It's the last week of December of 2024, and I'm just finishing up the other. The first one is Death and the Penguin by Andrey Kurkov, and I read this because initially I picked it because it fell into the humor category, or at least it was kind of pitched that way. But this is one of those tragicomic books, so it was not laugh out loud funny. It's a good book. I enjoyed it, and it is translated by George Bird. So, I liked this. But I was really thinking, wow, I could have done better. I mean, one book in the category. So I reached out to my Substack readers. And by the way, if you enjoy these videos, I don't make them very often anymore because I'm mostly over on Substack, and I send out a newsletter twice a week, and I'll link to that in the comments below too. So if you want to subscribe to that newsletter, you can hear from me more often and hear what I'm up to and what I'm reading and what I'm thinking about as a reader. But anyway, I reached out to my Substack readers and I said, can you recommend another book in translation? And so right now I'm in the middle of a novella called Eastbound by Maylis de Kerangal. It's, I hope I pronounced that right, I don't know, but it's translated from the French by Jessica Moore. It takes place, however, in Siberia. This is about a soldier who's been drafted, essentially, and he's on a train full of other young men, and the train is heading east and into the depths of Siberia, and he's afraid and he really doesn't want to be there. And that's the setup, and then he meets a woman on the train. I'm not even quite halfway, I'm about halfway through it, so I can't even tell you, but I don't give spoilers anyway, so I wouldn't tell you the ending even if I knew what it was. This is my other book in translation for 2024. So that leaves the category that I had the most trouble with, so to speak. The category that in September, when I went to check on how I was doing on my goals, I had not even thought about. And that was to read a book by an author that I already know and love. So basically like expanding my reading of an author that I had already read maybe a couple of books by, and I really wanted to get to know that author's work better. So I kind of went through my bookshelves and really gave it some thought, and then I chose sort of 3 finalists for this category. One of them was George Eliot, the author of Middlemarch. Another one was Annie Proulx, and funny how many Annie Proulx books I've already read, because every time I read her, I sort of have a strange reaction to her work. It's almost like I keep reading her looking for something, but there are some books of hers that I hadn't read. So she was my second choice, and my third choice was Thomas Hardy. And that's partly because I love Tess of the D'Urbervilles so much. So I polled my Substack readers again, and I said, okay, these are the 3 authors that I'm thinking about reading some more of. Which one should I choose? And what book should I choose? By far, I mean, it wasn't a lot of people voting, but I got some really enthusiastic endorsements for Thomas Hardy's novel, Far from the Madding Crowd. I just finished this the other night. I will say I still love Tess more. And I think that's because this is an earlier Hardy novel, and I can definitely see the seeds of Tess in this book. The setting is very similar. It takes place in England, out in the farm country, and there are a lot of rural characters. But in a way, Hardy in this book I felt was making them into more caricatures, whereas I think in Tess, those characters are a little bit more fleshed out, almost as if his understanding of the people of the countryside had matured. I also think that Tess is a stronger protagonist than Bathsheba, who's the protagonist of this novel. She's quite a flawed, well, they're both flawed protagonists, both of those women, but he doesn't judge Tess. Hardy doesn't judge Tess the way he judges Bathsheba. He has some sympathy for women. You can tell that he's ahead of his time, but he hasn't quite evolved yet as much as he does over the next, I think it's maybe 17 years between those 2 novels. And again, it's like a much more mature understanding of women that comes through, I think, in Tess. So this is, Far from the Madding Crowd is like a great classic. I mean, it's like one of those early rom-coms, basically. There are some funny moments and some tragic moments, and I actually kind of got taken by surprise about halfway through and realized there was a connection between some characters that I hadn't recognized. So it's a great read. I really enjoyed it. And so this was intended to meet that 8th category of reading another book by an author that I already knew and loved. So that brings me to my 3 favorite reads of the year. And I'm not going to put them in a particular order. I'm just thinking of them all as at the same level. And again, like there were other runners up that I could talk about, but I think these three kind of floated to the surface. There's a fourth one, by the way, that I'm still finishing the audiobook of, and I'll just mention it because it was also recommended to me in the category of humor, and it's a really wonderful novel by Nile Williams called This Is Happiness. And I'm not quite done with it yet, so I feel like I can't make it one of my favorite books, but it probably will be one of my top reads of the year as well. But setting that aside, because I'm not quite finished with it yet, one of my favorite reads of the year was kind of in the same category in a way as Nile Williams' novel, in the sense that it's a coming of age story about a boy. It's not funny in the way Williams's novel is, but it's very emotionally satisfying. And that is Rose Tremaine's novel, The Gustav Sonata. I didn't really know anything about Rose Tremaine. I knew her name. I think I found this book because I was on one of the audiobook platforms. It would have been either Hulu or maybe Libby. And I was just kind of scrolling around looking for something to listen to in the car. And this popped up and I thought, oh, Rose Tremaine, I don't know anything about her. Well, Rose Tremaine, if you look her up, is an incredibly accomplished writer. She's actually Dame Rose Tremaine. She has a long list of prizes, an even longer list of novels and short stories and a memoir. So she's a writer, you know, speaking of reading more work by a writer you enjoy, she's a writer who I would definitely go back to again. But I would say that what I loved most about the Gustav Sonata is just first of all, the writing at the sentence level is beautiful, but also just the story of this friendship between two boys. It's post World War II and it takes place in Switzerland, and one boy is Jewish and one boy is Protestant. Or Christian anyway. This novel actually won the Orange Prize, which no longer exists, unfortunately, but it was a prize winner when it came out. There's not a huge plot, but the characters are so developed. This is one of those books that I really just got immersed in. I just fell into it. I would look forward to listening to it every time I got in the car. I was drawn back into the story every time. So one of my top 3 reads for 2024 was The Gustav Sonata by Rose Tremaine. My other 2 favorite reads were brand new books that I read for my hardcover book club, one fiction, one nonfiction. I don't even have copies to show you because I've loaned them out because I liked them so much. I loaned them out to friends. I'm not even sure where one of them is. So let me talk about the nonfiction book first. And that is a book called Poverty by America. And it's written by Matthew Desmond. He's probably better known for his book Eviction, but he's, I guess, essentially a social scientist. And the argument he's making in Poverty by America is a very provocative argument. So Desmond's premise is that poverty exists in America not because it's an unsolvable problem, but because we don't want to solve it. And so I would really recommend this book to anyone who lives in America, who wants to understand poverty better, and who thinks it can be solved, because understanding what's really causing it points to some solutions that might be unexpected. So I'll just give you a flavor for, it's a 250, 300 page book, but I'll just give you 3 points that he makes about how poverty is perpetuated in America because the rest of us benefit from it. So one example he gives is exploitation of low-wage workers. So the reason our products, so many of the products that we consume, are relatively inexpensive compared to how much it costs to manufacture them is because they're being manufactured and shipped on the backs of low-wage workers. So that's one way in which everyone else benefits from the poverty of low-wage workers. Another example he gives is what he calls subsidized affluence. So, for example, when we file our taxes, if we own a house, we get a mortgage interest deduction. That's a benefit that you get if you are wealthy enough in America to own your own home. And it takes away from the opportunity for subsidizing people in poverty, for using some other mechanism for giving people a tax break. So that's another example Desmond gives. And I'll just give you one more, which is segregation of the poor. So the creation of affluent neighborhoods, very exclusive neighborhoods, which is probably true of most of our neighborhoods, at least in urban and suburban areas in this country, where all the wealthy people live in one place and all the poor people or the working poor live in another place. And they may interact on the street, but they don't live next door to each other. And living in poverty breeds poverty. It's hard to lift yourself up out of poverty when everybody else around you is also living in poverty. And likewise, when you're living in an affluent neighborhood, there are all these other people around you to help you stay affluent. And so that's another example of why poverty exists, because Desmond would argue it's something that we've chosen as Americans. So it's a very provocative book. I started taking notes and then I started talking about it with people. So that was definitely one of the most, I wouldn't say it was the most enjoyable read of the year, but it was definitely one of the most influential books I read this year. And then finally, my third top read of 2024 was Yael van der Roden's novel, The Safekeep, which I mentioned a couple of minutes ago. I don't have my copy of that either, but it was shortlisted for the Booker Prize. It starts out kind of, I don't want to say quiet because I don't like using that word to describe books, but just sort of innocuous, I guess. It's set also, interestingly, like the Gustav Sonata, it's set in post-World War II, in this case, Holland. And the main character, her name is Isabel, lives alone in a country house that she used to live in with her mother, who has died, and she's quite isolated. The best way I can explain the premise of The Safekeep is that it uses that very old trope of a stranger comes to town. So essentially her brother, who's a businessman, tells Isabel that he needs his girlfriend to move in with her for a couple of weeks while he's away on business. She has no place else to stay. And Isabel is not happy about this, but that's the premise of the novel, is bringing these two women together who aren't going to get along. I'm not going to tell you what happens from there, except to say that I don't know how far I was through the novel, maybe 3/5 or 4/5 of the way through the novel, and suddenly something clicked. And I'm sure this is what van der Roden wants to happen. Something clicked. And then she did something that I love when authors do, which is she suddenly switched up the novel. And I know some readers don't like that, when you've learned how to read a novel and then it does something different. But I love it when that happens. And so quite far into the novel, there's a shift that changes everything. And that sort of re-energized my reading and brought me through to the end of the novel. So The Safekeep, great novel, should be coming out in paperback relatively soon. Highly recommended. It was one of my favorite reads of 2024. So that's the recap of my year of reading. Not quite in a nutshell, maybe a little bigger than a nutshell, maybe a watermelon. And there will be a companion video to this one in which I will reveal my reading goals for 2025. So some of the categories will be the same as they were for this year, but I have some new, different ideas about what I want to read in 2025, and I'll talk about those in my next video. Thanks for joining me. If you like what you see here, please subscribe. Drop me a comment. Let me know about the best books you read this year. I would love to get some recommendations from you. And I'll be back soon with another episode of Better Book Clubs.